Hello and welcome to the next video in the Counterpoint videos. We're going to be combining everything that we learned in the species counterpoint videos. This is usually called Florid Counterpoint. Here, every rhythmic ratio is able to be used, along with all three types of voice-leading dissonance. So you have your dissonant passing tone, your dissonant neighboring tone, and your dissonant suspension. Of course, the suspension can be consonant as well, but when it is dissonant, that is one of the three types of voice-leading dissonances in these counterpoint exercises. Here we use a 4-to-1 ratio with the same beat hierarchy as the 4-to-1 exercise. Instead of thinking about each rule for each beat individually, instead think of the rules that allow for certain voice-leading dissonances. Let's break each one of these up individually, first starting with the dissonant passing tone. This can occur as a half note on beat 3. Of course, a dissonant passing tone is allowed when you have it approached and left in a step that are both in opposite directions of each other, with that dissonant passing tone in the middle of that. Dissonant passing tones can also occur as quarter notes on beat 2, 3, or 4. Now, dissonant neighboring tones, these can occur as quarter notes on beats 2 or 3. And now the dissonant suspension. So just a refresher, remember the prepare note is consonant, and for a dissonant suspension, your suspended note is your dissonance, which will be resolved by your resolution, your R. Because the dissonance is created from the suspension, it can occur on beat 1 of each measure, as long as it is resolved on beat 3 of that same measure, and also prepared as a consonance on beat 3 of the measure before it. We can elaborate the dissonant suspensions in a variety of different ways that will make them more interesting melodically. Okay, here we have a simple suspension. We have the given melody going from C and then F, and we have the counterpoint starting on E, which is the preparation for the suspension. Then that note acting as a whole note is shown as two half notes being tied together since it's occurring in two different measures. Being suspended into the next measure creates a seventh with F, which then is resolved down a step, creating a 7-6 suspension. Okay, so here are some elaborations that we can use to work with this 7-6 suspension example. All of the suspension elaborations that are shown are going to be on beat 2 of the second measure. This is going to make the elaborations in between the dissonant suspension and the resolution. None of these elaborations function as resolutions to the dissonance, since they are only elaborating in a brief moment in between the suspension and the resolution. Think of it as a decorated suspension. The first two examples show the use of tone repetitions, allowing us to re-articulate the dissonant tone on beat 2, or to anticipate the resolution tone on beat 2. Another option is to use an embellishing tone, accomplishing this by leaping to an inner voice chord member. So a chord tone that would be in the closed position of this chord. This is an interesting choice because it can create a richness where there is a delay in the resolution. And at the same time, the two different leaps are going to influence the shape. We can also include an escape tone, which is where a note is approached by a step and then is left by a leap. So in other words, from your suspension, it rises up a step and then it leaps to the resolution. And because it moves by a step and then it leaps to a consonance, it's an escape tone. Or if you're thinking about chords, this would be stepping up and then leaping to a chord tone. This one is less common and it is hard to make it sound smooth. Additionally, there are two more elaborations which use eighth notes for neighboring tones. First, we have an eighth note elaboration above the suspension, where the eighth notes go up a step from the suspension. So you can see the first eighth note acting as a neighboring tone as it just goes up above that suspended note, and then it returns to the suspended note as the second note of the eighth notes. So that's just a brief little elaboration, and remember that when you use a neighboring tone, you're just ornamenting that original note. So it's just highlighting that suspended note, and it's just putting a little bump in it real quick. And you can also see the stepwise motion that it creates as when you go up to that neighboring tone and then go back down to your suspended note and then back down again to your resolution tone. You can see that stepwise motion. The next one is an eighth note elaboration below the tone of resolution, using the same note from your resolution as the first note of the eighth notes and then going a step down before returning to the resolution. The lower eighth note elaboration is more common. The other way to include eighth notes in these exercises is with eighth note fills. Here we can see a half note E on beats 1 and 2, which leaps a perfect fourth to an A on beat 3. If we wanted to fill in the leap of a fourth with stepwise motion, we could have the new notes F and G filling in that gap. This works fine as long as the original half note is now changed to a quarter note, along with the two passing notes now becoming the two eighth notes. These eighth notes acting as passing notes need to fill in the span of a fourth ascending or descending. And it doesn't matter if they're consonant or dissonant since they are passing tones. But because they're passing tones, they must occur on the weak beats of the measure beats 2 or 4 of this 4/4 measure. Similarly, we had passing tones beginning in the 2-to-1 exercises and on, which filled in the span of a third. Since they were approached and left by a step, the passing tone created stepwise motion between the two notes that were a third apart. So here it's just two passing tones in the span of a fourth instead of filling in the span of a third. For added rhythmic interest, we can use a dotted half note on the first beat of each measure. Functionally, these will act like a variation of the 2-to-1 relationship, so you can think of it following all the same rules as we had in the 2-to-1 exercises. So now anything that would be allowed between two half notes, like in a 2-to-1 ratio, can now be done with a dotted half note followed by a quarter note. Additionally, there are some tips on how to distribute these different types of rhythm options in the exercises. Felix Salzer shows us an example of what not to do, where the slow half notes in the beginning of the section creating a 2-to-1 ratio occur in their own section, and then after that you have a whole section of notes in a 4-to-1 ratio, following by a full section of suspensions. Each different rhythm follows all the rules, and it's a good idea foundationally to where you have a slow beginning, you have a faster middle part, which goes up to a high point, and then you go down from there, and then you have a slower section of suspensions towards your ending. But composing it section by section like this not only makes it an abrupt change. When you go from one section like here, you have a 2-to-1 ratio, then all of a sudden you're in a 4-to-1 ratio much faster. But furthermore, when you're in each section, it's pretty predictable. Here, it's okay, we're in a 2-to-1 ratio. Here, okay, now we're in a 4-to-1 ratio, and the listener can tell that's what the section is. There's nothing else in the section departing from that. So that makes each own section predictable, which is not good. We want the music to have an impression of being able to change speeds naturally, slowing down or speeding up at any time. So listener doesn't expect, okay, it's going to slow down or it's going to speed up. Now they're listening to interpret what's going to happen because they are not able to expect exactly what's going to happen. That's what we want. In order to achieve this, the rhythms must be blended and not occur in isolated moments. When the melody changes speed, we want it to make sense in the context of the music, reacting to, responding to, or preparing for the velocity and momentum of the structure of the melody. Jeppesen gives us an example by Palestrina. This shows us a natural rhythmic arc. Similarly to Salzer's exercise, the melody begins with shorter note durations, then has a faster middle section, which leads back to a slower section at the end. But differently than Salzer's exercise, Palestrina's melody is rhythmically blended in a nice fashion. This example's purpose is to show the concept and execution of a rhythmic arc, where the melody has a point of interest that is also supported rhythmically. For example, here we see a high point of interest in Palestrina's melody, which is further supported by the medium note values leading up to the high point. Then there's fast notes on the way down from the high point, like how a roller coaster speeds up on the way down from a high point of the track. And different than Salzers, instead of having a section completely of one note duration, here we have some interesting stuff. Like if you had a roller coaster, for example, here we're heading down, maybe now we have a little bump, and now we're going back down. In the beginning of the exercise, the melody is often in longer note durations. This allows you to have more room for growth as the melody develops. Similarly to how the melody might start in a spot in the register, that allows for growth in the register, whether that is an overall goal to aim for a high point, low point, or maybe even both. With this, the beginning can be slow in speed, but also low in the register. So there you have two things supporting each other, and you have room for growth. This example we're looking at has a high point. You have a leap down lower here, a downward leap, but here you actually have the highest point of the melody, which is being leaped to. We have some interesting stuff though, and we're going to talk about it. So approaching the high point, we want to create a sense of rising tension. This can be accomplished melodically by using quicker note durations. Then at the top of the high point, oftentimes longer note durations are used. Similar to how at the top of a roller coaster, there's a suspenseful pause before then you drop down from that high point. So what I drew here, maybe visualize it like this is a roller coaster, how it's going up the track, and we're going up faster up the track, and then we have that pause, and we're looking down, then all of a sudden we go back down, okay? But as you see, it's not as simple as just that, which also adds to the suspense, drama, and interest of the overall melody. Kinetic energy is energy in motion, while potential energy is the potential energy that something would have if it was put into motion. In the roller coaster experience, the overall kinetic energy is built up as the roller coaster rises up the track. Then it is transferred to potential energy as the roller coaster sits on the peak of the track, with all that potential energy that could potentially happen on the way down. The person riding can feel this potential energy slowly rising more and more as they're going higher up the track, finally feeling all of the energy now ready to be taken advantage of on the way down as they look down below them and see the steep drop. This pause at the top, along with the awareness of what is about to happen next, the fall, is part of the suspense. And yes, the motion going down the roller coaster is also kinetic energy, since it is in motion, but this is not a physics video, so that's going to be enough of the sort of physics talk. But you get the point. The energy rises up, and then we have all that potential energy sitting there at the top, ready to get released back on the way down. And you can think about the roller coaster experience, how it builds up the suspense as you're going up the track, and then you slowly sit at the top and you pause, and then you go back down. A lot of times it's much quicker on the way down. Maybe there's some ups and downs on the way and some loop-de-loops, okay? So just metaphorically speaking, you could see where you can tie these two together. But of course you're not using this to extreme or directly using that in that way, but it's a good way to imagine what's happening here. And with this, you can tie these two ideas together and come up with some imaginative ideas that maybe you wouldn't before. Okay, if we want the listener to expect that when they're rising up and then they pause that there's going to be a fall after that, maybe we could do something in the melody that causes a gap that wants to be filled, so then the listener knows that, okay, now we're at the pause and they're waiting for that gap to be filled, which a gap to be filled oftentimes is going to be a gap that hasn't been heard in the melody before. So register gap, we haven't really heard in the melody before, all of a sudden just happened. Then there's a pause after that, and the listener will oftentimes expect, okay, those notes in the middle of that to be filled in. So we can use these little things to our advantage here, maybe having the listener have some more expectation of the descent back down. But in terms of music, the kinetic energy of the faster ascending note values has been converted into potential energy as the melody sits on the high point, with that pause of the slower notes. Then finally, this potential energy is released as the melody descends, where just like the roller coaster, this is usually a period of acceleration. Then after this, the melody slows down, preparing us to smoothly resolve into the cadence. Again, the most important thing to pay attention would be the fact that here you have a change in the speed of the melody. We're going a bit faster as we're rising up towards the high point. Then the high point has the sort of pause, but it's not just a pause. It goes up to the high point, it's suspended, you pause, then you go up even higher, and then you pause, and then you go up even higher, and you pause, you go up even higher. So just for visual purposes, if we're thinking about this as like the roller coaster, then we see that the roller coaster didn't just go up to the high point and sit there and then go back down. It went up to the high point and then it sat there. And then it went up a little higher and then it sat there. And then it went down just a little bit, sat there, and then went back up higher again and sat there before going back down. So there's even extra suspense in what's going on compared to just sitting at top and then immediately going back down. And not only does it sit where it is, but it actually ends up getting even higher than the initial kind of high point that it leaped to in the beginning, which then leads us to the highest point in the entire overall melody here, which then of course after that we have the acceleration of notes where we have a change in note duration again, with these quarter notes going down, which then we slow down again smoothly going into this cadence. Okay, so you can use the idea of the track and the roller coaster and the high point and all that kind of as a basis and come up with some interesting or creative ideas. Fuchs gives us the advice to work in a fourth species basis for the Florid Counterpoint exercises. This means having the perspective of trying to have as many suspensions as possible. There are never too many suspensions. Whether that is consonant or dissonant suspensions, of course remember that the strongest type of interval for voice leading is actually the dissonant interval when used properly. So your seconds, fourths, sevenths, also anything augmented or diminished. So try to include dissonances in your responses. This is Beethoven's fourth species exercise that we saw in the fourth species counterpoint video. Pay attention to how the syncopated tied half notes create a repetitive and balanced relationship between the two voices. Compared to a 4-to-1 melody where the melody traveling twice as fast will cause the listener to have more focus on it as it is changing more, making it dominate the given melody. When listening to Beethoven's response, one only needs to pay attention to the given melody as it changes from note to note, while the counterpoint fills in each gap on the offbeats in a repetitive fashion. We could simply take this concluded suspension exercise, then we could add some faster note values to create a rhythmic arc, while also adding in some suspension elaborations talked about earlier in this video. That would then turn this into a Florid counterpoint response. Here we see Fuchs's example of a florid melody written above his well-known D Dorian Cantus Firmus. And here is an analytic diagram to that response. The suspension elaborations are not labeled with harmonic intervals because they are just decorating the period between the suspension and the resolution. We want to highlight the relationship of the dissonant interval occurring on the downbeat, which is then resolving to the consonant interval on the upbeat, just like the 7/6 suspension we see here. Removing all of the inessential dissonances leaves us with a rhythmic reduction, or skeleton of what we had originally that will still sound similar to the original melody. Here are 3 more examples throughout history of Florid counterpoint exercises over the same cantus firmus. Mozart and Schenker's melodies are pretty similar to Fuchs's melody. Jeppeson's departs from the others. It has much fewer suspensions, which shows that he was using a different approach than working in a fourth species basis. This is not bad nor wrong, just different and not what Fuchs recommended. We need to realize Fuchs probably said to work in a fourth species basis for a good reason, but that does not mean you have to, but is probably some good advice that's going to come in handy, at least for these exercises or some point. In terms of rhythm, Jeppeson's has a much more dramatic rhythmic arc compared to the others. Bellarmine takes a turn from the others, and he decides to make his response in a triple meter using a 3/2 time. This shows us a real example of how to apply Florid counterpoint rules to a triple meter context. Okay, so now we have a given melody here, and I'm going to do a walkthrough on completing this using the Florid counterpoint approach. Like always, it's often good to start on the end, filling in the cadence or the cadence with the approach to the cadence to make sure that you're not going to lead up to a moment to where you're not going to have a good ending. Let's end with a suspension. The 7/6 suspension is one of the best options that we can use for a cadence formula. Okay, next let's plan out the high point. This works well because of the overall contrary motion of the counterpoint with the given melody. Additionally, the high point in the counterpoint exists 2 measures later than the given melody's high point. These whole notes by themselves are boring, so let's make some suspensions with these as the basis. Alright, so now here are some suspensions with the basic idea from those whole notes. So now how do we fill in this gap between these 2 measures here? Here's the perfect time to use stepwise motion with the leap of a third in the beginning. Okay, now we have the ending, the high point, and then the gap between the ending and the high point. Now that's checked off. The other most important thing that we should focus on before anything else is creating a beginning. Starting on scale degree 5 allows more room for the counterpoint to grow versus starting on an octave. But now we could syncopate this melody to make it more interesting. Now this is all coming together and we just have a space here to fill. So what could we do here? So we see here in measure 5 some contrary motion in 3 measures of the given melody. It would be good if we could have the counterpoint go in contrary motion to this stepwise motion. And the best decision would be for the counterpoint to travel in stepwise contrary motion. We can see the counterpoint forms a sixth above the given melody, where then it leaps down to a unison, where then it travels up in stepwise motion with contrary motion to the given melody in those measures. But now we have the same note repeating 3 times since this suspension has to be prepared, and then now we have this note coming before that. But instead, if we interrupted that for a second with an embellishing tone, this now allows C to be prolonged through this entire measure. Now it can be in the first note of the measure and can also be used as the prepare note for the suspension. This is going to come in handy in many situations. Now we just have this one more gap. We could fill in this gap with a consonant suspension of C, and then also making E a suspension by preparing it in the measure before, which is again another consonant suspension. So with these, they don't need to be resolved down a step like our dissonant suspensions do. So this is the basis of the Florid melody: a beginning, middle, and end, with consonant and dissonant suspensions along with a point of interest, which first of all is in measure 5. We see that E leaps down a sixth to G, which is then recovered. Then we see in measure 8, C leaps up to F, which gets us up to getting ready for our high point. At this state, it looks more like a 4th species exercise than Florid counterpoint. Additionally, there is no rhythmic arc. From this point, we will elaborate the skeleton in order to contain faster note values with things like passing tones. We want to create a nice rhythmic arc in this area where we include faster note durations, preparing us for the high point. This will still leave the beginning as a slow section. We want to create a sense of rising rhythmic tension as our melody ascends, overall making its way to the high point of the melody, with some bumps and turns while getting there. Here we can see that the half notes have been replaced with quarter notes. These exaggerate the overall contrary motion, and now measure 5's original leap of a sixth is now a leap of an octave, from E to E, which actually creates a brief voice crossing. Another good place to add quarter notes would be measures 4, 10, and 12. This uses passing tones to fill in what would be the gap of a third originally. Okay, so now adding eighth notes. One method would be adding eighth note elaborations to the dissonant suspensions that we already have. A different method could be instead filling in the gap from leaps of a fourth. Here in measure 8 and here in measure 13 we see 2 leaps of fourths, and we know what to do there. Okay, so we changed the first note to a quarter note, which left the gap of another beat, or in other words, a length of another quarter note, which then we can fill with 2 eighth notes, which then fill in that gap of the fourth, making everything also work metrically in the time signature that we're using. So not only do these elaborations work, but they add nice moments to our melody that we already had. These are often also known as embellishing tones because we're taking this original skeleton that we had earlier and we're embellishing it more. We're just adding some things in the middle of some of these notes, passing from one note to the other note, just adding in some fillers in the middle, or like we had here to where we had half notes, and now we're exaggerating and actually building up to where we were at before, and then playing off the original foundation, making some twists and turns. So all this makes it more interesting, while at the same time you can see we are slowly building up a rhythmic arc that is getting faster towards this high point. So filling in all these gaps that we have creates a lot nicer melodic fluency, but good things always come at a price. Now our melody is so conjunct that in fact the only dramatic moment in this entire melody occurs here in measure 5, where E leaps down an octave to E, which then prepares us to rise up towards our high point. But in order to add some more interest in the register of the melody later on, and not just here in measure 5 towards the beginning, we could use an embellishing tone elaboration of a chord tone on a dissonant suspension. So we see a dissonant suspension right here of a compound 4/3 suspension. Okay, so here's one of the things that we could do. To be honest, I'm going to say that I'm not a fan of this choice, but for pedagogical purposes I will discuss it, as it shares some more information on what you could do and also opens up some other perspectives. Here's the example. First of all, it leaps down the leap of a seventh, something that's normally not allowed in these counterpoint exercises. And not just that, but the leap creates a bump in the melody that seems random compared to how the rest of the melody is. There's no other spots in the entire melody that just leap down to an area and then leap back to the same area it was originally at and then keep going. Here in measure 5, where we have the octave leap of E to E, we see from the leap, then it ascends up and we relocate down a step and we just keep going up. So it's definitely responded to, while the leap we just added to this dissonant suspension is rather random in how it's functioning with the fluency of the melody. But a lot of people seem to like this, so I'm still going to show it. This passage could be labeled as licenza, which indicates that one has taken an artistic license. This is not something you should do in your exercises, but this brings an awareness about something that you can potentially do in free counterpoint. Me personally, I'm just going to get rid of that because I think it's good enough how it is, and I'm a simple guy. I like it better simply like this. So here we have some given melodies by Jeppesen. We have one in C major and one in D Dorian. I'm going to have 2 options for these, so stick around for both of those. First of all is to simply compose counterpoint one above or below each of these, then make an analytical diagram to comprehend all of the underlying relationships, or to make it a little more practical. And these will be in a PDF document in the description where you can click on that and you can download it, whether that's on your phone and you can just write on it, or you want to print it from your printer and actually write on it that way, do it on your computer, whatever you want to do. And it's all zoomed out small here so you can see all 4 of these examples, which you'll see is 1 page of these examples. Because here, to make this a little more interesting and maybe challenging while still using the same given melodies, I went and transposed the given melodies. So the first one that was in C major, we now have D major, and we have it in the soprano line. So with this, you have two choices, and I recommend just doing both because then you're doing two different things each time. And first of all, looking at this as your soprano line, you could treat your counterpoint right below that as your alto line, staying within an octave of the soprano line, or you could put it in the bass line, treating it like a bass line to this soprano line. And with that, staying within a compound octave of each other, not going more than an octave still. So with that, you could, let's say, treat D major as your alto. So you're writing counterpoint in your alto, and then next you're treating F major as your bass. So now you're writing your counterpoint in your bass line. You're practicing reading and writing in two different clefs, while also switching the voices, and then also with that, changing the key center that you're using. Then we go down and we again have D major first and then F major after, and the difference is now we have both them written in the bass line. So with this, again, you have two options. So let's say in the first one, you could treat this as a bass to tenor. And with a bass to tenor, now you can do more than an octave up to a compound fifth. So you could throw in some tenths and some twelfths in this one, and then you could treat F major as a bass line to soprano line, and you could start writing in your soprano line with that staying within a compound octave still. So not going over an octave, only going over an octave for bass to tenor. So those are the exercises for major, and each one you can do them differently. Now I've explained this in previous episodes, but because the D Dorian Cantus Firmus did not contain scale degree 6, then it didn't reinforce the fact if it was in D Dorian or in natural minor, aka Aeolian. So with that, I treated it like it was in the natural minor, aka Aeolian, and I transposed each one from what I treated as D minor to now G minor and E minor. So now that single original D Dorian Cantus Firmus is now in G minor and E minor. We have the same thing where we have soprano above, and then we go down and we have the bass line below, and it's the same directions to where you can do the two different options where you can treat these soprano line responses as an alto line in the counterpoint and a bass line in the counterpoint, and then you could go down to where the given melody is already in the bass line, and you could choose to write right above it in the treble voice, and then you could also choose to write above it in the soprano voice. So that's it for this video. Be sure to stay tuned for the responses that are going to be for these exercises that I just discussed, along with a lot of exciting videos being posted at the moment around counterpoint and also song forms. I just had a video about sonata form, a pretty in-depth video explaining the basis of sonata form and how it can be edited and how the basis of that can be used to create a movement in something like a string quartet or even something like a symphony or of course a sonata. There's going to be a lot more videos about song form coming up, so make sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos, and give this video a like if you liked it so maybe more people can check this out. I don't have that many viewers at the moment, but I have about 150 videos posted at the moment, and I'm going to keep uploading videos, so there's a bunch of videos you can watch. Be sure to check out my playlists if you want to see an organized A to Z example of a topic. I have beginner one, I have the counterpoint, I have theory, I have one on chords. I even have some musical words, so there's fun stuff like that. And until next time, take care. Goodbye.